It's an absolute pleasure to welcome Benjamin Studebaker, Daniel Garner of OG Rose, and Michel Bauwens. Michel is an incredible theorist of the commons. He's doing wonderful work all around the world. I think he's one of the most interesting political, economic, civilizational theorists to pay attention to in this space, thinking about the present moment of our global civilization from a political economic perspective and looking at how it is progressing as part of world history. And we also have Benjamin Studebaker, the author of, I think, 2 books now, but I know you've got a third coming out soon. You're the author of Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies and the Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. And of course, Daniel Garner. Although all 3 of you have appeared on the Voicecraft podcast before, Daniel Garner has been on many, many occasions. We've discussed his work in Belonging Again, and most recently, The Map is Indestructible. And today, we're going to be having a conversation around the question of revolutionary subjectivity. Even framing this is quite interesting. This was initially inspired as a question, who or what is the revolutionary subject today, from a conversation I heard Michel have with Cadell last at Philosophy Portal, which I'll link to in the description, which I found to be super interesting. And Michel is living a very, very interesting life of an intellectual as well as a spiritual seeker. And Cadell and Michel really go through a huge part of his journey in relation there. But this question surfaced and it felt like an interesting opening. So I'm curious how your thoughts have developed, Michel, over the last month. I know you've been having a number of conversations with Cadell, both in Brussels and online. So I know there's quite a lot there. But to kick us off, I did want to ask the first question to Benjamin, and then all 4 of us will just begin a free-form dialogue where I'll be playing a little bit of a mediating role. Benjamin, how do you think about the prospects of revolutionary subjectivity today? I could maybe put a finer point on that, but maybe it's interesting to just leave that open. How do you relate to this question of the revolutionary subject, revolution in general? Please take it away.
Yeah, so I think that there's a category of democracies out there today that I call the embedded democracies. These would be democracies that have been around for a very long time. They've been around so long that there's both a positive and kind of negative attachment to democracy. The positive attachment being it's difficult to even imagine thinking of yourself as anything other than a citizen of that democracy. The United States, I think, would be the clear-cut example where this kind of thing is dominant. Americans have a hard time thinking of themselves as anything other than committed in some way to a constitution rooted in a founding moment. There isn't really anything else to unite them. They don't have a lot of the cultural markers that would otherwise typically be referenced in, say, a European context for constructing a notion of a nation around them. Whereas in a country like France, where there are monarchists and there are Republicans and there are people who like the Fourth Republic or the Fifth Republic or want a Sixth Republic or want something else, in the United States, it's very difficult to think of yourself as American in a way that's completely detached from this notion of a founding democratic republic. And then the negative attachment comes from these democracies having outlasted other kinds of political regimes and systems, like the Soviet Union, like Nazi Germany. These other kinds of systems appear discredited because while they have collapsed, democracy has continued. And what this does, I think, in these specific kinds of places is it produces a lack of confidence in the possibility of revolution. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a terribly positive attachment to democracy. Indeed, people can become very jaded about democracy to a very great degree. They can call it an oligarchy. They can say it's become techno-feudal. They can use all kinds of derogatory language with regard to it. But they lack confidence that there's a different political system type or regime type. So when they become discontented, their discontent tends to take other kinds of forms. Either it becomes social organizing, it becomes a pivot into some seemingly non-political terrain like faith or the family or fandoms, or some kind of futurist project around technology, and it kind of loses that political character. I don't think that this is the case everywhere. I think there are some countries where it's still possible for people to feel a revolutionary commitment to an alternative system type. We recently saw in Nepal a large youth movement in which in Nepal the population is more than 50% under the age of 30, large number of very young people taking to the streets, demanding that the government change, the military eventually siding with them and throwing out the government and installing a judge as head of government. So I think there are still some places where there's a sense that other regimes might be preferable, especially places that don't have democracy, or they have a relatively young democracy, a democracy that has not lasted for a very long time. But in these places with very old regimes, I think revolutionary subjectivity is off the table, at least for a while, and that this allows for disagreements and conflicts to spread deeper into the society because there isn't a risk that they'll produce a revolution. You can sustain a much greater level of disagreement and conflict over a longer period of time. And this not only extends the lifespan of the conflict, but it also tends to disrupt efforts to resolve conflict. So when people try to organize politically or socially to deal with conflict, the fact that they're in this embedded context means that when they come into spaces with each other, they tend to have disagreements that lead to infighting and eventually to collapse of cooperation.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, maybe I'll invite Michel if you'd like to share some of how you meet this question, and you're welcome, of course, to reflect and build on some of the themes that Benjamin's bringing in here. But in terms of how you see the role of the commons and the possibility that participating in change today, whether that's some desire for liberation or some orientation towards betterment or flourishing, in the most general terms here, how do you see the prospects for coordinating today?
Maybe the first thing I want to say is that, to my feeling and my kind of analysis, I believe we are kind of in a civilizational intercycle. So the best way to compare it would be kind of maybe the 14th century in Europe, where you still have a strong feudal system that still exists, that, most people in the countryside are ruled by, these rules of vassalage and, different ways of relating to the Lord and the land. But at the same time, there's this new system brewing in the cities in Italy and the Flanders and Germany, where something different is already occurring. And so, what kind of system is it? It's really two systems in one with two different contradictions. And so the one contradiction that I see is the old one, but it's decaying. And that's the contradiction that Marx would have talked about, capital and labor, either vying to transform the whole system in favor of labor, the radical option, or the kind of like, give me a bigger piece of the pie and I'll be quiet for the next 2-3 years, kind of, reformist, or even just plainly, surplus negotiations in a way, right? So that's still there, but it's decaying. It has lost its capacity to bring anything new. But it's not dead, it's there. It's, the system still functions in large parts to these rules. But then there's another emerging part, which is about networks. And that's where the commons play a big role, where I think there's a new contradiction between the people that are commoning and creating these new, common translocal infrastructures, and then the factions that exploit and extract from that new way, right? And I don't know if you're familiar with the thought of what's his name? Okay, his name will come back. But this kind of contrast between extractive engines and purification engines, I like that scheme. So the idea is you invent a new extraction regime. Let's say hunter-gathering, right? Like fire is invented, and now suddenly you can hunt for meat in a different way than ever before. it will change, whatever we would call the pre-hunter-gathering practices, right? And then, agriculture and mining would be kind of another extraction invention. And then industrial and whatever we want to call today, network, cognitive. So a new extraction regime is very brutal, very rough, sets in motion, basically new class divisions that take time to operate in society. And as these become exaggerated, without balance, that creates a counter movement, and those are the purification engines. So animism could be seen as a purification engine of the hunter-gathering way of life. The actual religions, the world religions, could be seen as a purification engine of the civilizational, agricultural civilization model. Socialism could be seen as a purification engine of capitalism and democracy. And then, today they're already in motion in seed form purification reactions to the extraction regime of the what I call the netarchical class, which is a bit similar to techno-feudalism, right? So I basically agree with Varoufakis, but I talked about this 15 years ago with Adam Arvidsson. We called it the value crisis, and so it's rent extraction rather than classic, capitalist surplus value extraction. So I think this is where we are. So that's one thing. So maybe another scheme I'd like to present, and sorry if I'm too long, you just stop me, would be Karatani's scheme, right? Which is very similar to what I just said, but so mode A, commoning and gifting in indigenous societies. Mode B, invention of the state and redistribution. Mode C, the market. And mode D is the permanent attempt to recreate mode A at a higher level of complexity. And the explanation for this is the belief that Karatani has, and I share that we are wired for convivial living, but that civilization alienates us from this. And so we always want to come back. So very similar to the purification idea, right? So world religions are the first attempt to rebalance mode B. Then we have mass ideologies, mass social movements, which are the attempt to rebalance modernity, industrialism, etc. And then I think constructive networks are the way to react to the crisis of, this new thing that is brewing, the netarchical or cognitive capitalist, whatever you want to call it. And so then I come to the weird conclusion that I realize that people find that kind of hard to swallow, but that the people active in Web3 and crypto are part of a revolutionary subject. But maybe they're the more extractive part of it, right? They're the more extractive force in this. And then you have the commoners globally who are trying to use the same technologies in a different way in terms of their interests. So I see a class struggle, and this is like at the heart of the matter, between commoners and those that either exploit the commons or create pseudo commons in order to create a new extraction regime. That is, in my view, more important, maybe not in terms of numerically, but in terms of where we are. Like, when are we? I think that's a very important question, right? And the when are we for me is we are already, in this stage where the new regime is kind of more important fundamentally than the old regime. So, going back to class struggle in a Marxist sense with, revolutionary working class and reviving socialism and, socialist unity, none of this has any bearing, in my view, of what we need to do today. It's like, and so, okay, I'm closing off. Imagine 1789, right, as the symbolic moment when religious formulations of change lose all their power. And imagine 1989 as the moment where these mass ideological formulations lose all their power. Like there's zombies, right? These are zombie movements from older forms that are still important, and people join them, but they don't have the power to fundamentally transform anything. So the power now is in the people organizing what I call cosmolocal planetary networks, where the new value regime is actually already working in seed form. So that would be kind of my thesis.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear you present it that way. That's definitely the tightest I've heard you run through those ideas on the Voicecraft podcast. So, yeah, Daniel, there is one direction here that I would love for you to touch on, but also I know that is just your opportunity to make some sort of opening remarks here. So please feel open to do that. But partly what I would be really interested to hear you speak to, one of the things Michel is pointing towards here is the possibility of constructive networks. He's spoken about how there could be maybe a more exploitative approach to new network formations, and then something that is more giving or enabling of the commons, planting these different seed forms. I'm wondering if you could speak to, as I know it's part of your work really, to think about what some of the challenges are of forming constructive networks. But please feel open to make some general comments as well. But I think that's an important onwards movement.
Well, this is magnificent, and it's wonderful to be here. And Studebaker, your work is very important, and Michel, your work's very important, and I've learned a lot from Michel. That overview you did of macro was extraordinary, that you did with Cadell. Really, really wonderful. And I appreciate also, Studebaker, where you've been emphasizing issues like healthcare and housing. I know you were doing that with Tony, and I think those are steps that actually can be made that we don't want to do because it over-identifies with the nation or some sort of logic, but then actually, then we just, our differences get entrenched and it gets worse and worse. And I really like that idea as well, that there's something about the revolutionary, dare I say, spirit or notion that actually keeps differences from getting overly entrenched. That if you don't have that, then you get these differences and they just get worse and worse and worse. Because basically those differences seem to become what people hope in. Like I can hope in that difference. And almost part of the issue is that people almost feel that if our side wins, that would be a revolution because we don't have power now. And if we were to win, that would be a revolutionary act. But the issue is that if you're, say, trapped in the same value form, the same logic of capital, then you're just moving around chairs on the Titanic and it's not really making much of a difference. And it also makes me think, then I'll speak to what you were saying on networks, Mr. Adalin. There's that kind of idea in Hegel that Hegel is the dialectical thinker, and obviously he is, but Hegel also, and people like Dimitri has emphasized this, Hegel did not like to be called a dialectical thinker because ultimately the movement of the dialectic was for the sake of speculative reason, which is the ability to think and imagine beyond the back and forth and the back and forth. Now, of course, Hegel's dialectic is ultimately things themselves are passing over into otherness. But of course, that invites the question of, well, what must reality be like that things are always passing over into otherness, that things in their very identity must become something else to become themselves? And without speculative reason, which I think is tied to the revolutionary subjectivity, you just pass into otherness, then pass back into the previous otherness. You just pass. You go for a first turning, then a second turning, third, fourth, and then go back to the first. And you have these various repetitions that seem revolutionary to the people in them, but ultimately it's actually a repetition on big enough of a scale or different enough of a vantage point, right? So when I think of the word revolutionary, the first thing that hits me with that is it is the subjectivity that is opening up, if you let me say this very crudely, it opens up a directionality that otherwise is not afforded by the predominant determinations. So if things continue the way they are, maybe you get outcome 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. And so nothing changes. You're going to get one of those. You don't know which one, but it's going to be one of those 6. The revolutionary subjectivity gives you 7. Which, of course, the revolutionary subjectivity then is very difficult for people to make sense of. They will be seen as strange. They will be not very intelligible. And part of the problem, I think, too, with talking about revolutionary subjectivity is people feel good to be, they want to be a revolutionary subject. It feels good, like they have identity, like we're fighting the man. Yeah, if you feel good being a revolutionary subject, that's probably not the revolutionary subject, actually. And if you can overly define the revolutionary subject, and it probably falls into the terms of the logical form that is pre-existing, leading to this back and forth that is not opening new directionalities and is part of the overdetermination that makes it to where we're stuck between outcomes 1 and 6, but not 7, right? So there's a weird thing where if you define what is revolutionary, well, that in of itself could actually just be reifying whatever is already overdetermined. But what would it mean to actually let, almost Thomas Wynne will talk about letting and letting be in the clearing in Heidegger, what would it mean for the revolutionary subject to come forth and that not be passive, inactive, and uninvolved, right? Those are very tricky things. And also, and this is where I think we get into the trouble with networks, it's one thing to do that, to let come forth, or to stand in a certain posture of the possibility of a revolutionary subjectivity with people like you who share your givens or who are similar, and then people who are significantly different from you. And that's always the massive problem, because if we form networks, like I think a lot of the troubles with networks, for example, is one of the reasons we actually fall into overdetermined logics of interaction is because we don't know how to handle otherness. Like when I encounter a different person, and you're unintelligible to me, and I can say, oh, you're an engineer. Oh, I run a wedding venue. We have a means of meeting one another, right? But now the problem is we could be overdetermined in our identification by the logic of capital, right? So how do you have a network where people are meeting one another who are different, who can handle that difference without falling back on an overdetermined logic of which would shut down the possibility of the formation of a revolutionary subject so that they're not overwhelmed by the otherness, so they don't misunderstand it, and so that they don't get hurt by it in a way that wants them to exit, right? Well, what a lot of people will do is just form networks with people where they're like, well, we want to get out of the logic of capital. Well, they're formed with people that say have identification in terms of Christian nationalism or whiteness or some sort of marker of identification that is a different logic. But unfortunately, that is not a pluralistic logic. And so it is likely to then narrow the scope of directionalities and determinations in line with one of those logical forms. So I think some of the challenges of the network is not ultimately drifting into symmetry, not drifting into people that are going to let you fall into an overdetermination, which would require you to basically be able to handle the anxiety of difference or to handle people saying things you don't, and then having the skill by which to interact and speak with people in a manner by which you are able to maintain that relation and not end up destroying it. Because that, we're pretty good. Like, I think, and then I'll stop here. We're fairly good at forming communities of people that are similar than us, that are able to say, go to church, everyone that's Christian, then people will help one another. If I call, someone will come over and help me deal with the farm or something, or we'll have a potluck or something like that. We're pretty good. People can do that. Now, another thing I've been talking, which would open a can of worms, is how the more and more we're able to get food delivered to us and never leave our room, that hikimoriism is spreading around the world. So people aren't even necessarily going to church or local communities. I think there's a spread of global hikimoriism, which I think is tied to, this would be another subject, but I've been looking up the invisible hand in Adam Smith, and there's like two invisible hands. There's the invisible hand of the market, but then the invisible hand of the moral sentiments. That means you have to interact with people to develop empathy. And when Adam Smith is alive, the only way to basically follow your self-interest was to interact with other people. So the two invisible hands were together. But now technology has developed a way where you don't actually have to develop social skills and the ability to interact in order to make money. So there's two different invisible hands now. And when those two invisible hands are split, then you don't have the invisible hand that develops empathy check and balance the excesses of individualism for becoming atomization or sociopath or et cetera, so forth, right? So those things are split because of the very technology that the invisible hand of the market has made. And so now we don't have to deal with other people So why would I? Because people are hard and they're difficult to understand, and my nervous system has been destroyed by the cell phone or different things, right? So the other thing that can happen is that networks can be a way to avoid real interactions with people and only interacting with people in terms that you want to interact with them at times you want to interact with them. And that is creating a simulacra of interaction, which is also possible today because of the splitting of the two invisible hands. There's more to say. I'm also really taken by the history of astronomy in Adam Smith, where he talks about the invisible hand. That's a pretty crazy essay, where he kind of equates the invisible hand with the forms, and that there are lots of invisible hands as there are forms. I'll stop now. But I've been thinking about that, and also the problem of forgiveness is the million-dollar problem in networks, because we have no idea how to go about forgiveness. That's a big one too, but I'll stop.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, so a number of things there. I think one interesting distinction to frame things could be between networks and community. But in staying with one of Michel's phrases here, pointing toward the direction of cosmo-local planetary networks in seed form, launching different seed forms, and Daniel's spoken a little bit to the challenges for cultivating, let's say, a healthy network subjectivity, sort of gesturing in the direction of some of those challenges. Benjamin, I'm curious how you relate to the prospect of networks in general, and of course in our current age a lot of that is mediated by our digital technologies, but there's plenty of ideology and logics influencing the communication and the constraints on those networks to speak to too. But what are you picking up on here? How does this possibility relate with your general political theory on where we are and what our possibilities are?
Yeah, there's a lot in here. I will try to get into a few things that stick out to me most, leaving over lots of other things that maybe we'll come back to later. The first thing that really sticks out to me is this idea that there's something of the 1400s in our period. And I think there is something to that. One of the ideas I like to kick around is a notion that we have Quixotic socialism now. We have a kind of socialism that is the socialism of a Don Quixote. So it's people doing things that at a previous time made sense and would have effects, but now because times and conditions have changed, acts that would have been meaningful in a different context now seem not just meaningless, but even crazy or insane to people. I think that this is, as Michel was saying, what has happened with ideological endeavors of both the left and right-wing varieties, that they appear to most people as quixotic or nuts. Of course, this means that the specter of them, if you can convince people that there are ideologies still on the march, this will terrify people into supporting the existing system. And I think that that's been one of the very effective tactics in keeping the existing system together.
Could you give some examples of those?
Sure. So if you think that the Trump administration is fascist, then you have to stop them because they are operating on behalf of a discredited ideology that is totalitarian and extremely dangerous. If you think that Barack Obama is a communist, if you think he's an Obaminist, then you have to do everything possible to stop him lest he install a terrible discredited regime type in your country. I think that has been very effective in getting people to continue to support status quo centrism of varying types and kinds. It's also been effective in getting people to support the left or to support the right on the basis that the other is menacing. I think both the left and the right experience themselves as impotent, but the other as poised to succeed, always poised to succeed, and that this is a fundamental misrecognition that each makes of the other. The other thing that I found interesting here, so thinking about 1789 and 1989. So 1789, we get a new kind of state. We get this nation state that has a capacity to motivate citizens on the basis that they feel a sense of identification with it that they didn't feel by that point with their Christian emperors and kings. the claim of the king to have a divine right or to have been crowned by the Pope, that's no longer motivating. It no longer produces legitimacy that competes with the legitimation claims of a nation state, which grounds itself on some notion of a people, nation, society. I think about this in terms of legitimacy because a lot of my work is about legitimacy. So I think about different kinds of polities as competing on the terrain of legitimacy. And legitimacy is, of course, to do with persuading people to do the things you'd like them to do, or to at least tolerate these things being done by others without them interfering, often in cases where they don't necessarily agree. So if you tell somebody to do something and they don't agree with you, but you want them to do it anyway without forcing them to do it, you have to legitimate it in some way. So you might say, well, these people won the election, so they have the right to make policy. And we're bound by that policy because we're bound by the results of the election. So even if you don't agree with the policy, you agree with the procedure enough that you will at least not stand in the way of the policy, even if it might be difficult to get you to make statements in support of it. The question for me in trying to suss out if there's something else that's political is whether there's something else which has legitimacy. So something else that can get people to do stuff, even in cases where there's intractable disagreement, where people don't want to work together and aren't feeling cooperative. I am much easier to persuade that there is social activity taking place, that people, in part because of their dissatisfaction with politics and with the political, are trying to get out of the political and go into different kinds of social terrain where other kinds of social cooperation is possible. That's kind of sub-political, so it involves a greater level of agreement and cooperation than you typically have at the political level. But one of my claims is that because we have this deep pluralism that's a consequence of this disagreement not being resolved at the political level, is that a lot of social organizing has also become subject to the same degenerative and disaggregating forces. So a lot of the social activities people go into to get out of the political end up recapitulating the same problems that exist at the political level. However, I do think that there is a lot going on socially. And I listened to Michel's talk with Cadell, and I was particularly drawn to his invocation of the monasteries in the late Roman Empire as this new kind of social structure, which didn't really rise to the level of establishing a new political regime during that period, but was able to replicate itself and produce a new kind of tradition, a new way of approaching learning, which eventually gave rise to the university system, so was very significant in terms of its long-term social impact, and had some level of political influence insofar as many bishops spent time in monasteries and then did take on political roles. So there was a dialogue with political authority. But I don't know that I would consider the Christian kingdoms to be revolutionized by the monasteries in a political sense, though there's certainly social and cultural consequences for that. So maybe some of my initial thoughts are to do with, to what degree is what Michel's talking about political in character as opposed to social?
Perfect. Yeah, and so it would be great to pass this over to Michel, but I just wanted to ask you to clarify something, Benjamin. When you're mentioning the intractable disagreements at the political level, and you're referencing now the possibility for new forms of maybe social interaction at the network level, you're naming that as sub-political, and that there might be elements of the intractable political which, because they have not been mediated well, are in some ways seeping into or working against the possibilities of building more, whether coherence or capacity in those social networks. Can you give some examples of what you're speaking to there that's seeping in?
Yeah. So when I talk about the political, I'm often talking about very deep kinds of conflict that potentially can come from separation of persons. So it can be just competing for status. It can be that we can't all have monogamous relationships with the same person. It can be very deep, very difficult stuff like that. It can also be stuff that's more historical in character, that's to do with a particular class configuration, one thing recently that I think has been a very significant factor is the growth of the university system since the 40s. So in the 40s in the United States, roughly 5% of people graduated from college, and therefore that 5% was in very elite roles and got a very elite kind of education to prepare them for that very specific, special set of roles. Now we have almost 40% of the people going, and lots of them, therefore, by necessity, are not in roles that are as elite or involve as much intellectual work. And this has caused a degeneration of the university system. It increasingly performs the same functions which high schools perform. So instead of giving people critical thinking and intellectual skills, it's often giving them a capacity to regiment themselves in such a way that they perform adherence to what seems to be critical or intellectual culture, but which no longer really is that thing, but is just a kind of ersatz simulation of that. And I think, therefore, we have a sharp cultural conflict between people who go through that university socialization and become acculturated to that kind of discussion and that terminology, and people who don't do that. And it's still something like 60%, a little bit more than 60% of the population in the United States that doesn't get that level of socialization, but in part because that part doesn't have the jobs in media, doesn't have the jobs in politics. It's disproportionately not represented in our culture. So there seems to be a kind of rough parity of these forces, even though it's probably still more 65-35 or 60-40. And this produces a tendency where if you try to get people together, these differences that come out of the university socialization or the lack thereof tend to produce conflicts in the way people talk, accusations of racism or sexism or various phobias, and this can drive people out, cause people to become disengaged, all of that.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, Michel, there's potentially a few important directions here, but one is this contention that Benjamin's making, which is casting doubt around the, if I put it into some of my language, sort of the potential integrity in the sense of the kind of strength and coherence of culture, of at another level network capacity, but sort of at the social, to be able to affect, in part to be able to affect political change. But there's also this other piece of the idea that what might be forming in alternative network ways of engaging isn't actually contending with dynamics which, if I'm understanding Benjamin right, are importantly upstream. In effect, that there's a certain set of topics, it seems like, and Benjamin, if I'm making an error here, it would be important to correct me, but there's a certain set of topics, whether, for instance, status, sexual politics, dynamics which, let's say, the cultural container writ large, the politics as power in a sense, has to be able to get right, or things at a lower level are going to fall into the same sorts of divisions. And so when I hear things like, the dynamics of the network state that biology and then others are associated in the context of Web3 and crypto. Now, you pointed that these may be slightly on the more sort of extractive side of an approach to generating value in the context of the commons. But perhaps it may be the case that certain handshakes upstream of the social interaction that's taking place at the network are basically going, well, how can we fit in with just what Singapore wants to do or the UAE wants to do? And we're basically going to accept a whole bunch of maybe really quite fundamental dynamics about human relating, whether sexuality, but maybe capital, capitalist logics and various other things which are really fundamental to how we relate, but are not open for mediation in the network as such. That's kind of one of the contentions I hear Benjamin sort of making. So how do you relate to this in the context of the possibilities for the commons?
So, there's a lot to say. So, okay, I think one of the things that I see as a difficulty, especially now, is how to make compatible harmony and conflict, right? So, for example, if you read Michael Hudson, I really like that scheme that he has that, once civilization was established as, a class society with, complex division of labor, etc., you have this kind of split between an East Eurasian model, which is all about harmony, right? Where like the Mandarins take power, not the military, not the merchants, and their role is to kind of harmonize society following, like a symbolic figure like the emperor, right? So it's all about harmony and managing harmony, making sure that conflict doesn't explode, keeping the merchants in their place, avoiding hyper extraction from any private class. So that's kind of a model that let's call it the East Eurasian model. And then what happened in the West was, in Greece, is the private class takes power. And that creates a counter revolution, which is democracy. And so we have a conflict based model, on the West Eurasian side. And they're still battling it out. Like Ukraine is where they're meeting and where they're battling it out. Okay, that's one way. I think, just to keep in mind that this is, in my view, occurring, this kind of permanent clash, right? And I often say you can't be an oligarch in China and Russia without the agreement of the states, and you can't be a president of the US without the agreement of the oligarchy. So, that's kind of like, in a nutshell, the difference between these two systems. So what I bring to the table is a belief that there may be a third system, right? Where because of the translocal capacity of these networks, we can now create like a translocal construction. Like any regenerative project locally can say, yes, I can ask for agreement with the mayor and the governor and, the local forces and the nation state, but I can also connect with similar communities in other places and create these kind of new forms of integration that are essentially, translocal. Anyway, so that's kind of I call it now the archipelago of regenerative projects as a third cosmolocal way of organizing our civilization. And so, okay, so let's put that aside. So another way that I look at it, and this is from reading quite a few macro historians, is like of a very streamlined vision of transition, right? Where you have, okay, the old system is no longer functioning. It has lost its integrative capacity. People no longer trust the old institutions. So, Benjamin mentioned the nation state revolution with Napoleon, I guess, and he invented a whole new way of creating unity around the nation state and the people nation. And the old just didn't work anymore, right? And so okay, disintegration of the existing integrative structure that creates atomization, that creates polarization, and they're linked, right? If you're alone, atomized, you look for who is most like me, what side am I on, and so, but the idea that I have is that there's no solution within that conflict, right? Between the pagans and the Christians, between the Reformation, the Catholics, that's not where the solution was. And so I think we were stuck now with this struggle that we have within the West, these two forces, so two wings of the oligarchy, one that is choosing the physical, the somewheres, and the other is, and so this is the struggle we're having. This is the culture war. And there is no solution within the culture war. That would be my contention, that this is leading nowhere but an exhaustion of these two forces. And so when the Catholics and Reformation were at each other's, and killing each other in massive numbers, like 30 million in Germany, the solution was a nation state, or, at least the emerging idea that would become the nation state. That's where, so the compromise that came out of it was to say, okay, let's put religion in the margins and try to found a civic religion around the kings and the dynasties to maintain a new type of cohesion, right? So that is what came out of this conflict. And so what makes me particularly desperate in the Western situation is the kind of the total degeneration of the managerial elite. So if you think of conflict and harmony, I think the original sin of the Western ruling class is a total abandonment of its working class. Starting in 1968, they're faced with a massive revolt of tens of millions of workers in France and the students. And I think the basic decision they made was, okay, we can't compromise with the working class demands. Let's give the students rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the 1968 cultural compact. But let's deindustrialize the West. And everything has proceeded from that original decision of a full abandonment of basically the local working class, which, was kept quiet with credit and, cheap products from the global south and cheap service through mass migration. And so that's the system that is breaking down. And so there is an author, I think his name is Evan Thompson, and he has a very interesting idea. So he says, okay, you have the 1%, the 10%, and the rest, right? And so the 1% rule but doesn't manage. And so they will choose managerial elites, and they're split in contending fashions. And the key is they can make mistakes. So he gives the example of the Dutch Republic of the 17th century was, a golden age, was, kind of like going everywhere in the world with the West India Company, I believe. And, giving all that surplus to the United Provinces in the Netherlands. And then, and they gave power to kind of proto-neoliberal managerial faction that said, let's abolish the guilds. And as soon as they abolished the guilds, the system collapsed because the working class was no longer willing to sacrifice itself in their wars, right? And then he shows, by contrast, that the English used the gold standard, where they could spend a lot of money in war, but then go back to a reasonable budgeting, and the guilds just kind of organically died out. And so the fact that they choose the wrong managerial elite that make wrong decisions condemned their society. And I think this is what happened when, the ruling class in the US chose the woke managerial elite. They made a fundamental mistake. And so the problem, I think, is that managerial elite is really fundamentally kind of lost in the West. There's nothing to be gained from the way these people are thinking and behaving. And I think that to a large degree determines our, kind of negative spiral. I don't know if I'm reaching fundamental analysis here, but I think, and that's why I think, there's no solution within that struggle. And, I know it's real. I know, millions of people are preoccupied with this. But I don't see kind of like a way out. So, okay, I will say one more thing. Transcend and include, right? So I go back to my first point, conflict and harmony. Like, you can't have just conflict. You need harmony, even in a conflict, recognizing societal model. And I think that's what the populists are attempting. Probably in the wrong way, but they're attempting to kind of a regression in service of the ego. like restore some kind of unity and harmony idea by going back to the nation state. And BRICS is the same, right? I see BRICS as basically wanting to, restart the 1945 United Nations without the hegemony of the West. But it's like basically the same core periphery, kind of capitalist system with different rules, maybe more harmonious, maybe more respectful of smaller players, less obviously extractive. And I don't think it's the ultimate solution, but I think it's a reasonable way of reacting when you don't know where to go. It's a reasonable attempt to kind of go back, to this idea of a civilization state, right? What can we do to kind of bind our societies together in a period of disintegration, in a civilizational intercycle? I think they have more chance of surviving than the West at this stage, at least in the short term. But then I think the hope for the West is our extraordinary civil society. I think that capacity to work together, to cooperate, to hold complexity together, to be flexible in organizational forms. So when I go to Europe, my hope is always that despite the mess that I see, that makes me frankly, depressive about actually going there. At the level of civil society, I see tremendous creativity on the condition almost that they forget about the politics, that they really get engaged in these constructive engage. And that's where the commons comes in, right? The commons is kind of an alternative way of binding communities. So one of the reasons I like Web3, and as you know, I was cancelled, and it was a terrible personal experience for me in terms of losing everything I had, even like materially, and difficulties of managing my economic survival, and psychologically I had really hard time with this. But when I go into Web3, despite all my critiques, I see a pluralist community that is able to handle difference in a way that I don't see any other community doing it. Like you can be a blockchain socialist, you can be a crypto commons alliance, you can be a token engineering commons, and you can be the most extractive, libertarian ideologue. But the thing is, they're making a common infrastructure, and it's a global common infrastructure, right? And I think this is something that you have to remember when you look at this kind of mess in the nation state struggles, that, there is this planetary layer. It's real. People are hedging the collapse of the nation states already, and they're organizing themselves to survive it. And they're doing this not just by local, they're also doing the local. That's why I talk about cosmolocal. But their imagination is no longer in the nation, right? And so I think we are in the 16th century, where Italian city-states and others were saying, like, we can't survive. The cannons and the new guns with pikes, and the standing armies of the dynasties. We can't survive as city-states. So what do we need to do? We need to scale. We need to find other ways of working together. So I think this is where we are. So there is a social imagination being born that the nation state and these interminable struggles that lead nowhere, this is not where it's at. We need to kind of invent a new social imaginary. And not the minority. I fully realize it's minoritarian, but that doesn't mean, you have to see the dynamic behind it, right? Is it growing or not? And I think it's definitely growing in strength and in capital and in self-organization and in ideology and attracting artists, etc.
Yeah. So I want to pass this over to Daniel. There's a lot there. One thing I think I'm picking up on, although you are saying much more than this, you emphasized at a certain point, well, in Web3, they're building global infrastructure. And it seems to me that part of the point Benjamin's making is at least certainly not totally locating the political just at the level of superstructure or the imaginary or ideas or ideology. I do think these things link together, of course, involving the social structure as well. But, you know, there is an interesting open question and gray area there for me around what sort of rule sets or games or constraints as infrastructures can be created without engaging with certain elements of intractability that appear at the political level. You are emphasizing the activity as part of as like an intercycle, so a time between forms, and so there's something temporary about that. So yeah, this question around whether it's how much collaboration, how much optionality and possibility can be generated by building infrastructure that might support modes of exchange which sit somewhat sort of resilience to perturbations in other aspects of the global system, so as to be at least some element of binding for some type of social process to occur through it or alongside it, which still leaves open many questions around what it is for human beings to live together and build together and navigate all different factors of perceived scarcity, actual scarcity, for instance, Benjamin pointing to at the level of sex and status and these sorts of things. There's a lot more in the stack that needs to be considered. But that was at least something that's sort of interesting to point to as an open question. So I'm curious for Benjamin's thoughts on that, but I'd love to bring Daniel in just to sort of locate yourself in this conversation, what you might be picking up on and what you might like to emphasize and build on.
Well, I appreciate everything that everyone has been saying. So a few things. If the term revolutionary subjectivity is going to be distinct from, say, alternative subjectivity, different alternative, maybe even saint subjectivity or something like that, I think for me, I'd like to define the revolutionary subjectivity as that of which would motivate enough people to a collective evolution in a manner that is not overdetermined by the pre-existing. Because I know Michel Bauwens has emphasized that evolution today is collective. So, for example, technology, if one country, we see this with AI, right? One country gets AI. If you don't want to be left behind, you're going to develop AI. And there's a certain collective evolution is not really just individuated. It's kind of more collective because you get bigger of a scale, right? So revolutionary subjectivity would have to somehow ultimately move in a manner that would change the directionality, if you grant me that phrase, of that collective evolution that is occurring, right? So, as an example, if everyone is caught in, say, a multipolar trap where everyone has to make AI, even if maybe superintelligence kills us all, because if we don't do it, they destroy us, a revolutionary subjectivity would legitimate what I would call a non-rational directionality to escape that Nash equilibria, and it would do that collectively, which would then open the condition of possibility for more people to do it. And although right now you're stuck in determinations 1 through 6, you open 7. But the point I will start to emphasize is that I think if we're talking the revolutionary subject, it is not just I individually figure out with 30 other people how to individually and maybe form an isolated community avoid, say, the multipolar trap, because that would be social but not political. And I think that, and I do think the revolutionary subject is going to be political, if we mean that in a distinct way. But then, of course, as Mr. Studebaker has taught us in his book, the way is shut. So what in the world does one do? And also, how could the social according to a new revolutionary subjectivity, value form, logic, etc., so forth, somehow get involved with the political and not in that lose its new form of subjectivity because of the compromises, because of the habits, because of the ways of interaction, etc., so forth, right? Now, I will give if I were to use those characteristics between political and social as kind of coordinates. So I'm quite partial to Change the World by Dr. Hunter. I am very partial to books like Randall Collins, etc., so forth, where the idea, and I will also use the fourth turning language, which I know can be overdone, but I do find it quite useful. So if I were to put all those thinkers together, you're currently in a period where, no, the social can't influence the political. The social is where a new imagination, a new social imagination can be developed, a new way of interacting with human beings that is not overdetermined by, I'll just say, the logic of capital, right? Okay, so the social's doing that over here. But the political don't care because, it can just squash it whenever it wants and it's not really impacting or anything. So what has to happen is the social has to work first. And I agree with Studebaker here. It says, how can we at least convince the political to increase the probability that we don't die, that we stay around, in that we can live in such a manner that, though determined by capital, is not overdetermined by capital. Yes, we still have to work. Yes, we still have to make money, but we are not overdetermined and lose the capacity to think of alternatives or to believe in revolutionary subjectivity in that, right? Well, if you could reform healthcare, get college costs down, affordable housing, these would all be things of which would, say, remove your need to be spending a lot of time thinking about money or working 15-hour days or something like that. And you would be sustainable over here in your social that you've convinced the political to say, great, that's a win, right? Because the social can't incubate different social imaginations to escape overdetermination. And by overdetermination, I have that idea of we are now overdetermined by, say, the commodity form or thinking in terms of the logic of exchange. But if you were determined by the logic of exchange, like you had to think in terms of market forces, but not overdetermined, you could still think of alternative possibilities, right? It's that overdetermination that becomes very problematic because then you get in habits and you lose that abilities, right? So you're currently in a state where you have to settle with determination, but can we do the work to get out of overdetermination if you grant that? This is where I think the network can be useful, like this conversation here, the social coordination mechanism, as I like to hate, because this increases the probability of entering into spaces where you can ask the question, hey, maybe revolution isn't always going to lead to the French Revolution, right? Because people have that sentiment in America. Every revolutionary activity is going to just lead to a reign of terror and we all die, right? Well, if you had conversations where you said, well, maybe not, that in of itself is helping you avoid overdetermination. Right? So can we create a relation between the political and the social that would help the social move from overdetermination to just determination right now, right? That would be a certain practical step, right? The second, following Hunter, and I think he uses the monasteries as an example, and Mr. Studebaker has written very well on the monasteries. Theosis, I also think, is an important concept. So basically, Mr. Hunter, the idea of a faithful presence is the idea that as an alternative social imagination is developed, if you can do the faithful work of being on the side of the road where the travelers come by, or here's the key, do your work in a manner that is visible, has the possibility of being seen by the political, so that it can open up their thinking of possibilities, but not in a way where they want to kill you, not in a way where they want to destroy you, right? And part of the genius of the monastery is it found that kind of middle, right? For a time, you could argue, that it was able to be seen by power, noted by power, open up possibilities to power, but not feel like a threat to power, right? So then it could influence the political without tripping the political into wanting to destroy it, right? So how can the social, which I do think Web 3.0 and everything that Mr. Bauwens was describing can point to, how can it be visible by the political to influence without the political turning around and saying, let's just use that to get rich. Let's just use that to make money. And thus then Web 3.0, if you grant that as a general, is now overdetermined by the political, which today would of course mean overdetermined by the logic of capital. And it is not opening up coordination possibilities of the social, right? This is for me the certain strategic thinking that has to be thought of for the relation between the social and political. And right now, so just following those steps, and my desk is covered in sticky notes, and I'm afraid I'm going to talk for 40 minutes, so I might stop after this point, is that I think right now, the name of the game is to create social spaces that are not overdetermined by capital. Determined, but not overdetermined. Now, of course, you could argue, where do you draw that line? I would draw that line in which you lose the ability to do something that people think is impractical. If you're incapable of doing that which people do, if you say you're incapable of doing that which won't make you money or get you a job, you're incapable of being seen as possibly wasting your time, you're overdetermined because you are too bent on having your life justified to everyone around you by the logic of capital, right? If you don't have any hobbies that don't make you money, that you just do because you believe in them, you're probably overdetermined by capital. If everything you do has to be quantifiable, it has to be something you can put on a resume. If it's something that's going to get you status in your community, you're probably overdetermined by the logic of capital. So look at yourself real hard and ask, what is something that I'm doing that I can't justify according to the logic of the society? If the answer is nothing, you're overdetermined. If there's something, then you're determined, and you've got a little opening there that can bring about possible changes in the social. So right now, the phase is to be doing that in the social, modeling the possibility of doing things that are non-rational, like having conversations at this hour on the East Coast with these fine people, showing that's a possibility to people, inspiring and legitimating, therefore, that activity to motivate people to do it, which would then increase the amount of people doing, and figure out a way then to relate to the political at this phase in the game to make the social sustainable so it can keep doing that, continue to incubate social imagination, and then think about moving in a manner, and all of this can be done at the same time, but I'm just thinking of it in more of a emphasis, I suppose, phrases. The next one would to be become visible to the political in a manner that can inspire. And then even, Hunter even describes as a faithful presence. You literally are working in the university or you're working in government and you are seen there without being overdetermined by it. Now, that's incredibly hard, though. Like you straight have to be a saint to be in Congress, for example, and not be overdetermined by the logic of the people there. But if you can do it, that is an example of faithful presence that can be a model and inspiring to people, right? But now, of course, the next step would be what exactly are the skills of shining with that alternative, talking about it, showing it, and convincing people of it, which then, of course, is the work of legitimacy as well. Like you're able to convince that alternative that Studebaker has pointed to. There is more to say, but I will stop there.
That's brilliant. Benjamin, I'd like to pass this over to you. I'd also like to add in the question, if you can weave it in. What is the political most afraid of?
What the political is most afraid of is something that causes the army to defect. Something where if you order the army to get rid of it, the army won't and will instead defect to that thing that you've ordered it to get rid of. That's what states are most concerned about. The revolutions of 1848 failed because when the states said, crush the revolutionaries, the army crushed the revolutionaries. To have a revolution, you need at least some substantial part of the army to refuse that order and for some sort of split to occur, especially in post-industrial, heavily digitized condition where the military is extraordinarily technologically advanced. If you go back to 1789, one of the things that made revolution seem very doable is the presence in society of large numbers of muskets that are roughly the same as the muskets that the soldiers have. The soldier's training might allow him to fire an additional shot per minute, which might be helpful in a line battle, but wouldn't have a tremendously huge positive effect in a battle in the streets. And so in those kinds of fights that they would have in European streets, often the question is, could you get cannons to the relevant place at a relevant time? That was difficult. It was hard. You had to lug them. It was very challenging to fight revolutionaries in the streets. Nonetheless, the states were able to do this in 1848 at a time when there was widespread social belief in socialist alternatives. Large numbers of people who thought there was an alternative way of living and structuring society, which they embodied in things like the Paris Commune for brief periods. So in that kind of situation, you have large numbers of people who really do believe in an alternative, but nevertheless, the military not defecting when ordered to put those people down, and therefore ultimately those revolutionary attempts failing as the military does what's necessary to put those people down. So the question that is there is not just, is there dysfunction, but also, is there something else that the military would choose rather than the thing that it's currently getting paid by and the thing that it's currently safe operating in the service of? It's very risky for a soldier to disobey an order to put down a revolutionary. The soldier has to really think that there might be something in the revolutionary movement to disobey that order. And for this reason, you never get this at the level of privates or sergeants. If you look at the history of this kind of thing, it requires at least colonels to say no. Colonels or higher ups to say no, because people further down are not willing to take the risk. They will just be accused of treason and locked up or potentially shot. And it's very risky for the officers even, because what if the officer next to you makes the opposite decision and now you have to fight him? And maybe he's been your friend, maybe he went to the officers' academy with you, and now you have to kill each other because you made different decisions in a split-second situation. So when we talk about revolution, this is where it ultimately goes. It ultimately goes to this question of, have you reached the stage of convincing the state's own people that your alternative is better than what they have? So I agree with Michel about how ineffective the nation state is. I agree that the nation state is not at all able to manage global capital. In my book, I talk about capital mobility as the fundamental unsolvable problem for the nation state, the thing that it cannot really come to grips with or deal with. Nevertheless, the issue is that there isn't something else for the soldiers to follow that's safer, that seems to them at least as credible, if not more credible. Religion and ideology both gave soldiers something to potentially die for, something that could be worth taking personal risk for. One of the things I see today is that there is a deep lack of willingness to undertake risk to oneself on behalf of abstractions of any kind, religious, ideological, social. There's very little willingness. People often make jokes about this. They take on these positions kind of ironically, but in part because they can't really imagine actually believing these things. And when they read history, it's kind of funny to them that people were able to think these ways for any length of time. There's a craziness about it, which means if you do an impression or impersonation of it, it's funny. And I think a lot of the 4chan Groyper stuff is a kind of attempt to do an impression or impersonation. The same thing goes for the quixotic socialists. There's an impression or impersonation thing going on. So there's, I think, lots of reason to think that the nation state is inadequate, lots of reason to think that the nation state is going to struggle going forward, not just to solve the problems that it faces, but even to maintain conditions or to maintain the things that it's instituted in the past, like our basic infrastructure, like healthcare systems in European countries, pension programs in Germany this week. There's all this talk of the German pension program running into trouble. The nation state is struggling to do these things, but if there isn't something else for the soldiers to follow, the tendency is for the soldiers to rally around the sick animal that is the thing that feeds them. Even though it's sick, it's what feeds them. It's what they know. And to defend the sick animal against whoever shows up. And it's become a lot harder to do a revolution since we got drones and air forces and all of these other things, in part because the revolutionaries in the streets are always clearly in an inferior position from the point of view of force. So I think that there can be something that isn't a language of force that can potentially produce military defection. We've seen this with color revolutions, where you have a large number of people peacefully assembling and having a general strike and shutting down the economy peacefully on behalf of things that they care about. That can certainly happen, and the military in those cases will sometimes defect to those people if it sympathizes with them. The question is, what is out there that the military could sympathize with, and something that can be sustained And then also often one of the troubles with particularly anarchist stuff is that anarchist stuff often involves calling for the abolition of the military or the abolition of force. So if you call for the abolition of the political or the transcendence of the political permanently, there's no reason for the military to defect in that instance to what you're doing. Some of the things I'm thinking about,
I'd like to react, Benjamin. So, I completely agree with that assessment about the role of the army, but I think we can look at revolution in two different ways. One is like this moment of radical change that we've associated with the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. But one of the things I discovered when I took a 2-year sabbatical to actually look at transitions was how rare that was, actually. I mean, it was a Tsar who abolished serfdom in Russia. It was a military caste that created the nation state, Prussia to Germany, religious civil war. So the form of the transitions was actually much more broader than this particular form of, political military revolution, right? And so one of the notions that I use is not from me, it's from Mark Whittaker, who wrote in my view, brilliant book called Ecological Revolutions, is the idea of jurisdictional alliance, which is a bit broader than just the military. So if we go back to the monasteries, and as you said, they operated within a system doing radical changes in many different ways without kind of prompting a reaction of the power. And I think that was because they actually were the only ones able to feed the people. That was actually the way to restore society. And I was just in Kash in the south of Turkey, and I was working with young Turks who had this historical consciousness, and was really interesting. And when the Ottomans would conquer, the first thing they would do is send the Aki guilds, the working craft guilds, and the dervish brotherhoods to reorganize the abandoned villages and restore agriculture and production. So there was this kind of complementarity between, and I think feudalism was the same. It was a military system, to train and feed the knights. And it was this kind of other thing. And they found this kind of arrangement. And so I think one of the reasons that so when I say Web3, I don't think Web3 on its own can do anything. I think it's a exit-based, extractive, elite movement, right? And then below, I see the same. I see a massive exit of people doing, regenerative, re-ruralization. And, these things are, despite what we've seen on television, these things are actually happening. There is a movement at the bottom of people finding solutions for their issues and creating all types of initiatives, communities. And so jurisdictional alliances, for me, it would be the equivalent of the alliance between the monks and political power. It would be an alliance between all the people doing the actual regenerative, productive change and some section of the elite that sees mutual benefit. So that's kind of my view. And I have to be honest, I don't really know how the military would fit in that picture. So I'm very grateful that you bring that up, because I need to think that through. But I'll just end by noting that we just had Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, where the army actually switched to these young revolutionaries. But then again, I don't see that as movements that bring any fundamental change. The kind of corruption, liberal mass movements that, want the system to work as it's supposed to instead of what they're seeing. I don't see this as fundamentally changing social structures. They're just like surface political changes. So thank you.
Well, this is I'll leave this open to either Daniel or Benjamin, and then we'll continue the dialogue. One question I'll ask without extrapolating on it, because I do feel it points us in the right direction. And the question is, where is conversation possible? And what are the impediments to conversation? We could say communication. And I'm specifically wanting to keep in here the aspects of the military, as well as the tensions associated with inter-elite conflict and the exiting into some of the network context that Michel is speaking about.
Okay. Well, so one of the things that I sometimes think about a lot in terms of the universities and the monasteries, actually. There's a kind of cycle of elite education that we seem to be in, with the monasteries having given rise to universities, which have now come into crisis. And they've come into crisis, I think, for reasons that analog with those of the old rhetoric schools of the late Roman Empire. Those late Roman rhetoric schools were rejected by young people because they seemed to only prepare you to slot into these imperial roles that didn't give you an opportunity to do anything meaningful or to make any kind of meaningful change. You were just there to defend a status quo. And that was evident, I think, to that generation that went off and started those monasteries. And I think Michel is right to say that those monasteries were successful because they did things concretely that were inspiring to local populations. And then, in part because they maintained some level of order in their communities through their activity, they were attractive to elites to fund and bankroll. I think all of that makes sense. I think something like that would have to be the first step. But I think that the really critical thing about the monasteries is that they permitted a new kind of intellectual conversation, a new kind of intellectual context that was both esoteric and exoteric. So it had an exoteric dimension in that it was able to interface with local communities and elites in a way that would get support from each of those. At the same time, it made space for an esoteric discussion among the monks, because they could engage in their monastic habits and rituals, their prayers, their discussions, and their transcribing of texts. They could do all of these things, and then there would be specific occasions where they would come out of that routine and interface with other people. There would be elites that would come to the monastery, and there would be interfacing, but that interfacing was limited. So the thing that really sticks out to me right now about a lot of the social organizations that are trying to start new kinds of intellectual conversations is that too much of the time is taken up with the exoteric, with the making the money by interfacing with public stakeholders, and that this interfacing with public stakeholders is very inefficient as a consequence of this. If you think about how much of the time of the people who otherwise could be in discussion with themselves about how to make a new thing is taken up with how do we sustain this practice and how do we get support from society, it's very inefficient. And I think in part, that's a symptom of difficulty still with getting support from other parts of society, which means that not enough is being concretely done that is obviously of benefit. And so to legitimate these new kinds of projects, I think that these projects have to show that they can do stuff. And part of why I've noticed there's a continuous failure to escape the universities. So the universities, I think we've acknowledged, have regressed badly. They've become penetrated by all kinds of awful political gobbledygook that has ruined them as spaces for having good, sustainable conversations. But it's still the case in most countries, with the exception of the UK, where this has disappeared, that there's a graduate premium, that you're better off going to college than not going to college because you're more likely to get a job that will pay more money. And I think there is this bare minimum thing about the university experience, which is even if it teaches you almost nothing, if you complete a university degree, you've demonstrated that you'll do what you're told and that you will speak this language. And if you can demonstrate those two things, that gives you a market advantage over a worker who hasn't gone to college and means that an employer will take you over somebody who hasn't gone. Even if you've learned nothing else, even if your degree is otherwise completely garbage, it demonstrates that much at minimum. Part of the crisis of the LLMs is the possibility that people are just cheating, that they're not even going through the miserable forms that they have to go through to demonstrate their willingness to submit themselves to garbage. But leaving all of that aside, I think we have not yet produced institutions that young people choose to join instead of the university. And that would be a fundamental first step. It's been talked about, and people have said, well, aren't the universities obviously garbage? Isn't the nation state obviously garbage? And these things are obviously defective, but we haven't yet produced something that people choose to do instead. It's sometimes choose to do alongside. It's sometimes choose to do after school, on the weekend, after work, while you're at work. But there isn't yet a kind of role in society that can be sustained that involves a monk has a complete commitment to a particular role that gives rise to a form of life. And I think that's what's ultimately needed. There needs to be a form of life. But maybe, Michel, I know you've studied this much more than I could possibly have done. Maybe you know of some places or ways in which this is starting to take shape?
Yeah, that's what I was going to react to, actually. So, of course, I'm not saying we're anywhere where we need to be, but, there's this book from Zach Stein, and I used to work for the Civilization Research Institute for about 3 years. Well, this is again education and time between worlds, right? And he says, whenever you have these huge cultural civil wars going on, you can't talk there. It's like impossible because you have to choose your camp. You can't be integrative. You can't be bridging. And so you go into these invisible colleges, right? And you can explain Masonry, Rosicrucianism as attempts to create these protected spaces during the Reformation era where, like you take Masonic lodges, you can be a crafts worker, a merchant, and an aristocrat. And the image of God is abstract enough that you can have Catholics, Reformation, Jews, and Muslims into one space, and they can, do the esoteric, right? That's exactly what it was designed for. So that was happening then. And I think at least, that's what we're doing here. There are a tremendous amount of spaces where people are now talking outside of the university. So I think that's a given. Of course, I agree with you. It doesn't give you anything concrete that, you can give to an employer to guarantee your survival with that. But at least socially and culturally, it's definitely happening. It's, it's a new republic of letters. It's tremendously interesting. That's where I discover everything, basically. Almost nothing in academia is of interest to me. Now, but parallel with that, I do think they're the first inklings of a change. First of all, within the Web3, this whole pop-up thing, right? So you have to kind of see how efficient that is. So you have 50 million digital nomads. I don't know how many of them are, in the crypto Web3 part, but just to give you some indication, 18 million people in Vietnam have digital wallets, crypto wallets, right? 25% of the population in Argentina has crypto wallets. So it's probably more than most people in the US realize that, outside, especially in countries which don't have a stable currency, you have this motivation to join that kind of, semi-parallel world. So I think the right wing has decided largely not to send their children to university anymore. There's the Benedict option. There's a movement that I like, I don't know why exactly, but it's called New Polity. It's based in Steubenville. And they're like conservative, but, social Christian, Catholic Christian Democrats. They adhere to the social doctrine of the Catholic Church, and they've created these new schools, St. Joseph the Worker, and I think there's 3 of them. Of course, that's not a lot. Where young people, it's a 3-year program. You only pay the first year, so you're apprentice, fellow, and master. You learn a craft, and they've established in these books that you have 50 crafts and potentially 200 that even throughout industrialism have maintained working class families. The obvious ones: plumbing, roofing, bricklaying, but here's a crucial thing: they're combining this with high level intellectual training. So these young working class kids are reading Thomas Aquinas, are reading Dorothy Day, they're reading, the labor tradition of social Catholicism as they are learning their work. And, look at the figures of males. Males are quitting university. I think that you can objectively verify that this is happening. It's about 2-1 now but in the UK, you have 2 times more chance of going to the university if you're black than if you're a young, white, working class boy. Like, this is just a reality that, that they are facing. And so they're quitting because they know they don't have a chance, this is something I would talk privately with Cadell, but people like me, once you get in trouble with the liberal establishment, like, everything is closed, and if I look for money, it will always say, we will favor, and then follows a description of everything that I'm not. So I cannot even compete for funding because of my racial and gender characteristics. So I agree it's not anywhere where we need to be, but I do think that there is this underworld or underground world where, at the very least, we are preparing this shift. So we are not nowhere. We are already somewhere in that attempt to create, some kind of alternative structure. Okay, let me just tell you a bit more about the pop-up villages, because I think that's important. So they started with pop-ups, right? So these are places where they convene, 500, 1,000 people, up to 5,000. And so for like a month or 5 weeks or sometimes 3 months, every day you have like between 5 and 20 lectures, right? Very intense in one place, self-organized, a tremendous amount of like downloads of mutual experience. So then they did something on top of that, which was called the archipelago of villages in Chiang Mai, where I live, where we had 12 pop-up villages during 5 weeks, a few thousand people, between 5 and 10,000 probably. And, it was amazing, like 25 events per day to choose from, very high level experienced people that talk about what they've done and how they solved issues. And, now is this one going on in Patagonia. So then there is something new, Zukash, where I went, just before, last few weeks in Turkey. This was the first oasis, right? So they're going from pop-up villages, which is just temporary, to actually saying, let's create permanent places where people can come once, twice, 3 times a year. And we are people rooted in our place. And they even have this idea of recreating a caravanserai, right? So they want to, these Turkish young people want to create a network of learning places that follow like the Central Asian routes of the Silk Road. So, it's not done yet, but they started. So I do think these are seed forms that are, going in a particular direction. They're not mature, but we are already there where you can see that something is forming that is giving an answer to your question.
Daniel, please.
Oh, wonderful that what everyone has said. So, if this is the 4th turning and this is the 1st turning, then we have to be here become indispensable, sustainable, and offer an alternative mode of subjectivity. So, like you're saying, the monasteries were indispensable. And so as you have this, you have invisible college, whatever you're doing, that you're in those spaces creating an alternative mode of consciousness, and you've got to become indispensable, okay? Because once you become indispensable, even if the politicians notice you, they can't destroy you because you're indispensable, right? There's something there that then keeps them back, okay? So if it's the time between worlds, time between turnings, where we want to break everything up, but, as Studebaker says in his book, a great leveling event would be terrible. Be careful what you ask for, right? But you're here. How do you there, as the social, become indispensable without, in that, sacrificing the incubation of a new mode of subjectivity, a new collective intelligence, all right? Hold that. Second, I am a strong believer that speech forms subjectivity. That the ability to speak is actually strongly formative of what kind of being you are. Okay, we can look at in the giant claim I would make is that speaking trains analogical reasoning in a Cadell, Kripke, I'm thinking, because language is analogical, and the only way to get new forms of subjectivity is through analogical reasoning. The ability to see otherness in a thing, therefore you may be determined, but you're not overdetermined. You must develop analogical reasoning to be determined, but not overdetermined. Because in a sense, you're always going to be determined, but can you not be overdetermined, if you grant me the way I'm putting that, right? That will always require analogical reasoning. And speaking trains that, but a certain kind of speaking. It has to be the speaking that is more philosophical in character, long-form discussion. You don't know where the conversation is going. It's not quantitatively based, and it is able to gain capacities. And Studebaker has pointed out the lack of political capacities today. I think those are tied together, actually. Like the ability to actually hold in reason analogically is actually going to also make you be able to handle hearing the other side because words are not so direct. Like part of the problem now is without analogical subjectivity, whatever people present you with is straight on. It hits you straight on. But analogical reasoning allows the ability of the transcendence and the inclusion, right? Because in analog, a thing is and something else at the same time, right? So like a metaphor, but metaphor and analogy are different. And this also suggests why people like Aquinas and the classical people in Cadell were obsessed with analogical reasoning that led to the analogy of being. And if there is something that Studebaker has suggested about the loss of the possibility of people dying for abstractions, like there are no authoritative abstractions, that is going to, in my opinion, go with the loss of analogical reasoning in your society, right? Because these abstractions are not things I can even move toward in my subjectivity. So they're not going to compel authority over me. I can talk about them, but they have no legitimacy. They have no weight. They have no motivational force. They're certainly not going to be something that will compel me to be willing to die. So if you don't have spaces of freed speech, you're not going to have analogical development. And if you don't have that, you're not going to have new forms of subjectivity, and therefore you will be overdetermined, not determined. So it's very important to create spaces of what I call, or I've called, freed speech. There are many people who talk about that. I'm a big fan. I do like Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Routes. The loss of free speech equals the loss of knowledge acquisition testing. It's really bad. Dietrich McCloskey talks about the great enrichment being a freedom of speech. I am quite partial. D.C. Sindler will talk about speaking as what Plato does to surround the apathetic abstraction, and that analogical philosophical dialogue there creates. So places of training that is a very big deal. Okay, so Mr. Bauwens has pointed to many examples of where this is occurring. So this is my opinion. We have said earlier that at this point, basically the social has to get a little hole into the political to make it sustainable so that it doesn't die. It's not going to take over the political, but can the social do something to at least not have to make money so much that it becomes overdetermined? So the thing that if you were to say, what is the law? What is the thing that I want to change, that I would go to government and petition, that would be a little small thing that the political may not even notice or care about? It would be changing the certification system. Because what we have right now, I like to say that basically colleges have a monopoly on credentials. It's not technically a credential. It's not technically a monopoly, but it basically kind of is. So a social revolution that we could actually do is where people are willing to actually accept alternative forms of certification, where they are actually willing to accept actually seeing, hey, these people from the pop-up schools, they're actually smarter than the people that come from these other colleges, and they're willing to then take a risk with these people who don't have the certification. And Mr. Studebaker pointed earlier that people don't want to take risk anymore. Yeah, that's a problem. You're not going to get any revolutionary subjectivity without risk-taking. But this is a risk that people might actually be willing to take. I'm going to hire this person off of these spaces online instead of a university, right? Now, here's the issue. This is where the network and this technology, the social coordination mechanism is a really big deal. Until we were able to record Zoom videos or use Zoom in this way, there was not really possible to create, the average person couldn't create what I would call a portfolio of their capacities. You were reliant on the resume, which the college gave you. Well, now, if I want, before I hire you, I want to make sure you can do the job. Well, the universities give you the check, certification, good chance, right? Well, I can just go on the line and watch you do it now. Or I can just have a call with you around the world and interview you quite easily. So Ivan Illich really emphasized that the kind of this limiting of certification, which is different than regulation. See, we're not talking, a lot of people, you may hear this and say, are you saying get rid of regulation? The conflation of regulation and certification has been a massive problem. The idea of certification was to make sure you didn't get incompetent people that would cause problems and do all of these terrible things. So you had certification to make sure that didn't occur. That, thanks to this technology, is not needed so much anymore, actually, especially if you're talking in terms of teaching, lectures and presentations. I also think it's important, though, for this space not to make an enemy of the universities and instead exist dialectically with them, because universities are still going to be needed for researching massive scientific experiments. You can see them as training schools for being surgeons and all of these different things. But when it comes to the training of subjectivity, the liberal arts, you now have a means by which to show that people are capable of that, is not reliant on the college certification. So this is my main point. Okay, so if you were to successfully change the or start a culture of people accepting alternative certification, ergo the portfolio of the YouTube channel, because it's kind of like a portfolio, you can see what people do, and you would actually convince people to do that, that would be kind of revolutionary. That would start to actually lead to a certain social change. And then you started working on the laws where then, it's not going to make you, the problem is the current regime of certification is tied to litigation. People want to avoid getting sued. They want to be, this person did something dumb, but look, I've got this certification. It creates legal protection. I think also Supreme Court rulings on employment testing in the 70s were very problematic. All of these things are holding back, okay? So you have all this potential that's happening online, right? But it can't go mainstream, right? I would argue that's because of the certification regime. You break that up and it starts going mainstream, and then you might actually start becoming indispensable because you're able to generate the most capable professors, the most capable thinkers that are able to actually handle difficult conversations, that are able to actually help bridge pluralism, and you start making this space indispensable because it's the only space that's able to create those kind of people that are able to actually teach and incubate new forms of subjectivity and probably also swim through the waters of pluralism without ending up in some of the temptations of fascism or splitting apart and all of that, right? Well, if all of those, say, political movements of fascism are getting your world destroyed or in big trouble, you really need the kind of people who are able to actually work people out of that space or navigate the waters to not end up there, right? Suddenly they become indispensable, right? So I have a lot more notes to also say about bourgeoisie, subjectivity, and Catron, because that's actually part of this revolutionary issue, and I was thinking about that. But I'll stop just to say, first turning, fourth turning. Right here is the transitional possibility where people can be open to new forms of subjectivity, where they may be open to revolutionary possibility. But in order for that to work, it has to be sustainable and it has to become indispensable. And what small things can you do in the political to go toward those ends, right? We've talked about healthcare. Studebaker has talked about that, housing, and doing things to change the culture of certification. You change that, you can start actually working toward making the space indispensable. And that's when I think you can change. So those thoughts came to mind.
I'm just reminded of the ideas of David Chapman in metarationality.com. So he's a kind of advanced Buddhist meditator, but also, well trained in philosophy. And he has this. So he comes from what's called integral theory, right? Which is kind of I'm part of that tradition. So the idea is to be kind of a blend of historical materialism and historical idealism. That the subjective and the objective always have to be held together in one interpretation. And anyway, so he has this particular theory which I find very interesting. So he says, okay, so the postmodern revolution in intellectual thought was done by people who had a classical training. So Derrida, Foucault, they knew their classics and they were critiquing the classics and modernity, and they kind of knew what they were talking about, right? So then what happens is we start deconstructing education. And basically his contention is that we're no longer training people to rationality. People are staying in the pre-rational, and then they go to the university and they're deconstructing. But they don't have anything to deconstruct, because they never actually had a good rational training. And so he says basically, and I believe this, that the humanistic training is kaput. It's terminal, and it blocks the evolution of our civilization. On the other side, though, in the STEM fields, right, a bridge cannot fall down, a building cannot collapse. So these people, they actually do get rational training, but in a kind of still mechanistic way, kind of still 19th century thinking. But he says, but you can work with them, so you can give them integrative, holistic, cybernetic training, and so that's the way forward. And I tend to believe this, that So I personally feel that people who've gone through, the studies and all of that, like, I don't know what you can do with them. I think it's terminal. But the people who have technical training, they can be broadened into more integrative understandings. So that's one thing we can do in the universities. But outside of the universities, we can retrain the humanistic. So that what you just said about analog reasoning. I don't think you get that in university anymore. And so it's so important that we have these other spaces. And I feel that, despite like superficial things you may look, I think at this stage of history, despite all the stupidity that you can see, there is actually on the right wing a lot of, new thinking, pluralistic thinking, questioning norms and dogma. And I just wish I could find it on the other side as well, but it's not very common at this particular moment in time.
Okay, so
Studebaker notwithstanding, of course.
So I'm going to make a few comments here pointing to some further directions, and then we'll pass it over to Benjamin. What I'm about to open up is sort of it's both pointing back to many conversations that we've had on the podcast before. I'd invite listeners to check out the ongoing series on cultural shamanism with Daniel and myself, Aspasia, in one of those conversations too. So in this conversation, we've sort of had a few levels going at once. On the one hand, we've been pointing to what is breaking down or terminal about presently existing institutions, while at the same time noting that at the level of power and energy, one of Benjamin's analogies was to the sort of the dead body of the animal, which nevertheless can still feed. In this case, he was speaking about the military, which is there. There is a certain stability and momentum at present to those dynamics, and the charge has been sort of a lack of an alternative. So we've spoken about some of the institutional decay, but then also spoken to where it may be possible to open up alternative types of institutions, mostly through the language of seed forms. But in those cases, it seems to me the language of sort of the center and the periphery, or the satellites, is quite important. Some of the examples Michel is pointing to in noting dynamics of BRICS as well and what have you, there's a certain sense in which these are alternative network structures, which of course have their own centers of centralization. You know, how the attitude and disposition and organization of China relates to this conversation is quite interesting. One could make the case that there's potentially a model of stability in what China's offering, although that it wouldn't export well. I'm not advocating for that. Obviously, people take different perspectives about China, but that there's something of a project of stability that China represents, and I'm interested in what kind of satellites could be in relation with that. Is quite curious. So I'm wanting to point to, on the one hand, the possibilities for conversation, building, collaboration that may be possible at the satellite level, which could potentially avoid having to relate with some of the intractable, highly energetically charged political dynamics, let's say, in closer to the heartland of the West. I'm curious about what that space of possibility opens up, but also what it might be avoiding. I don't think we've spoken to that massively. That was present in the conversation in terms of what aspects of the political might some of the social network dynamics on the periphery be avoiding, that actually will come to have tremendous problems. You know, Michel mentioning that those who may be more technically trained could in principle be open to more integrative understanding. That's an interesting proposition. It doesn't immediately land with me, but there is a sense in which those who may have avoided, to the degree you see certain social philosophies as being in their own ways sort of disenabling of more integrative thought, then, you know, that's an argument for, if not having taken on that kind of worldview, one could say, well, there may be some more openness there. So that's sort of partly there in the conversation. The question is one of education in some important way, and what present context may be open to what kinds of educational possibilities, and where it's possible to engage in the kind of education and cultivation of character and consciousness and relationality and embeddedness with land. And all of that has to be understood at the level of what kind of infrastructures and power structures and social structures are enabling that or not. So we've got these different levels operating in the conversation. And I do think through that, there have been some interesting concrete sort of provocations made that would seem to offer some angle of address that involves all three, in terms of at least a hopeful step in Daniel pointing toward certification as an address of something like legitimacy in the context of collaboration, which could be a meaningful kind of bottleneck. Now, there's plenty of things to say about that in terms of how the institutions might react, or what kind of dynamics and forces could be working against that. So that's an avenue for a whole conversation. But the main thing that I was wanting to bring in at this point, which certainly points us toward a different conversation here, again, one that's been present on in the podcast, and one that also opens up, I think, the criticality of the more mystical dimension, the more spiritual dimension of understanding consciousness and mediating consciousness in relationship as such. Now, Daniel's pointed to something like this direction in the language of faithful presence. Key point being there, well, both of those words are very important, but presence is the one I want to pick up on. One of the things which I believe to be very important is, and it can be held somewhat distinct, importantly distinct from discourse, or even the capacity for rational and moving into analogic mediation in conversation. I do think one has to have the capacity to engage in and has, in some sense, has already cultivated a certain quality of presence in order to engage in analogical conversation. Now we can say analogical conversation also supports the cultivation of that kind of presence. I'm not necessarily saying what has to come before the other one in a linear way, but I do think there are different ways into understanding what it is to open up and, in that sense, be able to take leadership in the healthy generative regulation of social tensions and energies, either through the viewpoint of improving one's quality and capacity to mediate discourse and participate in an analogical way. And also it can be approached through the endeavor toward increased capacity for energetic regulation and, in a certain sense, capacity for receptivity as such. So one of the things I have quite a lot of experience in now, having made many efforts, obviously many thousands of hours of this at this point of conversation online, but also many event contexts locally, there's a very broad spectrum of, let's say, experience and history of like education in the humanities or the sciences or what have you, and or interest in different levels of discourse. Now, just to point to some of the continuity in the project, and you mentioned sort of Carl Hayden Smith before this conversation, Michel, but in talking about hyperhumanism there, and also in the work with the Museum of Consciousness, pointing toward how different kinds of sonic experiences, in this case, different tracks that can be very profound and intense to listen to, is an example of introducing into a social context something which is, in its own way, quite psychedelic. It's creating a lot of intensity in the psyche, bringing different things up, and in engaging in certain kinds of intentional listening, and then with a little bit of light mediation, not at the level necessarily that's going into sort of unpacking the great mysteries of the world as mediated philosophically, although I think this is interesting, but in terms of being able to share different kinds of reflections and tensions that are coming up, I'm seeing also a big interest in storytelling at the moment, which is taking off in lots of different places. And these are sort of specifically not contexts in which discourse is being mediated or even analogical reasoning is being participated in, but just more being in the presence of the difference and the tensions and the meanings of lives lived, and what kind of community spaces can enable the metabolization of that together. The different sort of myriad art forms and modes of regulating and enabling a greater receptivity to, well, the integral facets of life, just to stay with using that framework, is something which can be approached. I think probably it is both of value in the context of the satellites and on the periphery, but when I look at what it is to be in the heartland of, let's say, the intractably polarized West, then indispensability and value to me, in part, looks like the addition into the social sphere of contexts which actually help people regulate their energy, connect with others, and I could go on, but just leave it at that and sort of leave some of the clues in what I'm saying there. Now, I obviously have a great interest in bringing in more of the philosophical aspect and linking these things in all the manner that we're talking about. I love the idea of, it's definitely a vision to move towards sort of, educational centers. I mean, metaphorically or physically, on the Silk Road, all that stuff is kind of interesting. The final thing I'll just say is that I think we do see actually examples of young people who are at least promising in the domains of tech, mathematics, traditionally STEM type cognitive capacities, as sidestepping the university in the direction of the network state and the tech different kinds of tech companies, we're seeing that largely, again, come from the otherwise left out of the, might not have the most attractive passports. So biology might say something like that, right? Whether from India or from different Asian countries, African countries, what have you. But the thing is, in those contexts, it does look to me like there's a very, more likely than not, it's sidestepping the university and funneling into a logic of capital, which may not, from the perspective of the founders of these network states, require at all an education in the humanities. Now, what becomes of these contexts in terms of their social aspect and their political aspect as mediated by, or as at least as influenced by the possibilities of that social imaginary, is of course a very interesting question. So, there's obviously a few caveats there, but I'm wanting to point towards the role of presence and the cultivation of capacity for receptivity as actually being really key to all of this. And in terms of understanding the prospect of building social projects and networks which are meaningfully progressive in some of the directions we've spoken to today, and which could also hope to resource themselves, I am seeing, in my experience, the tremendous gap between the hopes for more integrative, philosophically discursive contexts. There's an important role for those, but I think there's a lot of collaboration at the level of art and culture, sport, character, these types of things, which are, to me anyway, looking like the kind of seed forms of generative cultural activity, not necessarily in a revolutionary way, or at least many steps removed from that, but in terms of meeting the moment of our cultural milieu anyway. So I point to those as some really generative directions where there's tangible efforts being made in this context and in our broader networks, which I think deserve part of a mention. And so maybe with that, I'll just pass it over to Benjamin and see what you might like to reflect on the conversation as a whole, what questions you might be taking on, what conversations to have in the future that you feel might be most interesting, and we'll see where that leaves us.
So, as I listened and thought about each of the last three responses, I found myself thinking increasingly about Hobbes and Vico in particular. So, Hobbes's Behemoth, where he advises the kind of education that the sovereign should instantiate, one where the citizens are not trained to think about abstractions, because if they're trained to think about them, then they'll disagree and continue to have religious conflict, but are meant to be trained in the sciences so that they can be useful to the king and extend the king's wealth and power to expand the space for commodious living. It seems to me that this kind of Hobbesian education was never really fully achieved in modernity until maybe just very recently. That there were, of course, continuous attempts to get people to argue less about fundamental values and to focus more on how they could be useful. But that's only really come off quite recently. Along the same lines, thinking about Vico, Jan Battista Vico, the author of The New Science, I'm very into Plato. I think insofar as I'm somebody on the left who is a little different, it might have something to do with the degree to which I'm into Plato. And of course, Plato has a cyclical account of history that he gives in the Republic. And the democracy in the Republic gives way very quickly to a tyranny. So one of the fundamental questions for anyone who kind of wants to uphold Plato is, how have they sustained democracy for such a long period of time this go around? And in The New Science, I think Vico points to some degree in the direction of why, that there's been a kind of extension of the age of reason Vico argues that there are two ages of reason, a new one that he's seeing in early modernity and the old one in classical antiquity, and that in between there's a poetic and heroic period with religion and mystery and poetry and stories and knights and heroes and all of that. And that the question is, can they sustain this age of reason this time, or will they lose it again to another age of poetry and knights and storytelling? And I think that Hobbes's corporate state and the form of education that Hobbes prescribes is the attempt to sustain indefinitely an age of reason that never gives way again to poetics or to heroism. The Hobbesian nation-state has run its course in terms of its ability to solve problems, but just as it has run its course in terms of its ability to function, it has kind of triumphed at the level of education to a degree that I think it never before triumphed. So we have a moment where our population is least able to meet the challenge at a time when the scale of the challenge and the obviousness of it is very there. And I think Daniel's point about certification, the corporate state has created these various mechanisms for protecting its mode of education from competition. And the certification, I think, is a really great example of a mechanism in the law that just makes it very difficult to initiate at scale some other kind of education that would offer an alternative to this. And the inducement, if you're in the STEM fields, is why would you even want to get involved with this political stuff? Doesn't, arguing about religion and fundamental values just get you in trouble at work? Doesn't it just cause you risk and the possibility of being canceled? Why should you want to know about these things or get educated in these areas? There's a kind of basic Hobbesian argument. You can have commodious living if you ignore these things and just go along with whatever the HR department says, and you'll be able to live well. I think in talking about certification, Daniel got very specifically at the crux of this, which is that there's still a set of impersonal structures. You can have a population which has lost the ability to reason individually, but which has alienated that capacity and even expanded upon it, but at the level of the corporate and the impersonal. And when we talk about capital mobility, a kind of system of incentives, which has a logic to it, operates on the basis of some kind of reason, but isn't grasped by very many particular people, and indeed doesn't require very many people to grasp it as individuals. And if very many people grasp it as individuals, then it might come into question. It might lose legitimacy if it were understood, because then the awfulness of it would be made apparent. I think that this is the kind of overhang that we're having to contend with, and it's an element of this system that is still getting stronger right now for the time being, even as many other things are becoming more obviously dysfunctional. And that's why I think it strikes us as the obvious impediment. The obvious impediment is something like, for instance, the fact that in the West, the civil society organizations all have to go through that bureaucratic processing mechanism of registering as 501c3s. And there are the corporate law fixes to a large degree the forms that these organizations can take if they want to be tax-free. So if you want to get money from wealthy people, those people want that money to be tax deductible. And therefore, you have to conform to the organizational type, which gets the tax deduction. Those rich people could give money to other kinds of organizations, but they don't get a tax deduction for doing it. And that in and of itself is a huge impediment to the constructing of other types of things. And it just comes out of the corporate law. It's just the fact that the state still, in a kind of dead way, defines what organizations will receive various kinds of treatment from it. And it's that tax issue. Ultimately, if you're in Argentina, then of course you want to hold crypto because the Argentinian currency is so unstable. At tax time, then you'll convert that crypto into the currency so that you can pay off the state. You'll have to do that. There's still this this corporate mechanism, which is very much still hemming in the degree to which we can make things that are competitive. And I think it comes from an effort to extend beyond its natural lifespan, this system. We can kind of think of an extremely elderly person in great pain who is nonetheless being forced to stay alive with an enormous amount of science, really natural science, that is sustaining something that otherwise would have died a long time ago. And as a consequence of its living long past its natural lifespan, it's able to propagate various outmoded cultural forms. You can imagine if your great-great-great-great-grandfather was still somehow alive in a decrepit, decaying state and controlled all the money in your family, was the paterfamilias in your family, all sorts of things that you might have wanted to do or that your ancestors might have wanted to do, even if they were viable, even if they were compelling at the level of ideas or culture, would just not be able to get off the ground because of the fact that he would still be alive and would be in his decrepit condition going, no, not that. No, I don't like that. That's what I find myself thinking about as I listen.
It's
Vico and Hobbes and the state as an extremely sick elderly person. And also, it's not that the animal is dead, it's that it's sick. The army's got a cow. The cow gives milk. The cow is sick and the milk tastes bad. But if there's no other animal, or if the other animals around are mice or they are gophers or something, there's something there, but you can't imagine that you would be able to milk it, even though the cow is obviously sick and decrepit looking. Are you going to get rid of the cow? When you're down to your last cow and it's a miserable looking cow, what do? Do you try to just keep the cow alive because everything else out there is even less suitable than a cow? And I wonder if that's kind of where we've been, and maybe we've been here for quite a while. The world wars are not really proper revolutionary situations, but are symptomatic of attempts to sustain something longer than it should have gone.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Benjamin. Yeah, there's so much truth in that. Michel, can I ask you to share with us some questions, or a question that is tied to the sort of the frontier of your endeavor and adventure at the moment? I'm curious if you were to feel into and generate a question that you are holding very close or deep at the moment, what would it be?
Well, I'll give you the slogan that inspires the question, which is, can we go from the commons for capital to capital for the commons? For me, and that probably started in the Neolithic. We invented a monetary system which incentivizes private wealth creation to the detriment of the common good. And that has been intensified by capitalism, which completely obliterates the concern for externalities and pushes it, in the back. So we have, in order to do regeneration, we have to extract and we need to extract more to do a little bit of regeneration. So regeneration gets unfunded, gets de-incentivized. So the kind of beast that Benjamin is talking about, that's the beast. And it's way beyond capitalism. This is a beast of civilization. So that's the question. How do we get to a system that recognizes care, regeneration, not as an afterthought, but as the main concern? And in that sense, history has regressed. We have a history of regression where, in hunter-gathering, that was the reality, was keeping the balance so that people could live. Empire recognizes the commons and capitalism destroys the commons. So how can we tame that beast? That's like, because I think otherwise we're dying. Like we had this very thin, what Daniel describes, like between the fourth and the new turning, But this is not just a 100-year turning. This is a 5,000-year turning. Like, we need to upgrade the civilization model so that it takes care of regeneration and care. And we still don't really know how to do that. So how do we do that? How do we get that shift that we need to survive as humanity?
Fantastic. Daniel, can I ask the same question to you? And bring us home here, but in the form of a question. What question are you holding deeply at the moment?
It's like Jeopardy. Oh, can I do it in the form? This has been magnificent. I'm going to scream with all the stuff about the tax forms and the Okay. Let's all start there, everyone. Let's start with that one. Let us change the law so rich people can give money to alternative places that don't have a particular tax structure and get a deduction.
It's massive. You have to be rich in order to start a charity.
How to do there? Okay, so this will maybe be a question. I'll work on it. Okay, so Mr. Studebaker has made an argument that the flows of capital are unstoppable. Let us accept that as an axiom. You're not going to stop the flows of capital. Okay. Well, how can we just increase the amount of places that flows? How do we critically? You were mentioning Vico, oh, beloved Vico. So some people have described that as the return of the strong gods. Okay? That's where everyone's going back to their cultural identity, their religions. It's the return of the strong gods. Okay? What we need to do is direct the unstoppable flow of capital toward those strong gods. That will hold back the strong gods, right? You got to figure out how to use the unstoppable flow of capital in a manner that keeps the strong gods from coming back while simultaneously giving people the benefit of the strong gods, ergo the poetics, the storytelling, etc., so forth, right? We have not figured out a way by which to bring back the poetic age without it destroying the age of reason, right? Because that's usually what occurs, right? Well, what if you could take that unstoppable flow of capital and actually direct it toward that problem by actually creating sustainable spaces of the social where people can get the fix of their strong god without their strong god being a tyrant that destroys everything. So Land and Dugan had that talk, right? And they're all talking about liberalism destroying particularity and, people need, and difference is deep and liberalism has been a disaster. This is what Berger and Philip Reeve and all these cats have been saying, right? If you take away from people their givens, their identity and their story, they don't like that. They get kind of upset. And they eventually are going to come back and it's going to be a big explosion, right? And so liberalism takes that from people. But then the issue is, you get rid of liberalism, get ready for World War III and get ready for all sorts of trouble, right? Okay, so you have this problem, okay? And the idea is, how in the world would you figure out to thread this needle, okay? Where you get the benefits of liberalism without the trouble or the techno-Cthulhu, et cetera, so forth, right? Okay. Well, if you decide how to do that, you're going to already be overdetermined in the logic by which you go about doing it, right? Because you haven't created the sustainable conditions of the social by which to actually, create a different logical form that is not overdetermined, just determined, right? So, now, this isn't the form of a question, is it? Let me just say it like this. Okay, how do we convince the IRS to change the, I had stuff to say on the bourgeoisie, and the drones. I was also going to talk about the military stuff, and that's why the Second Amendment, where the people are supposed to be the militia, so you don't get the problem of the army. And I do wonder if AI and drones are actually going to help with this problem of the military. If everyone has AI, is that a return to the Second Amendment, standing militia? Maybe it's worse, I don't know. Anyway, this is the question. Okay, how do we convince the IRS or the business structures to open the avenues by which capital can flow in new directions and people not worry about getting audited, or we not worry about getting audited to receive the money and have to do that? And how do we also convince people to break down the college monopoly on credentials, open up avenues of certification? How do we do that? So this is what I'll say. So everyone, okay. These would be the practical and I'll stop. The practical ways we're going to deal with revolutionary subjectivity tonight. This is what I'll sum up and leave all those sticky notes over there for my morning routine tomorrow before wedding stuff. Okay. So the practical things is, one, do the political work to sustain the social. Reform healthcare, reform housing, stuff Studebaker has talked about. Okay, that's good because that's going to help. All right, do that. Then second, open up credential opportunities where it's not bound to the old person on the ground saying only that's allowed, because that's their final hurrah of having power to say the only certifiable way, and they drags down to the depth. And then also to reform ways that money can flow by reforming taxes or tax deductions. Those people ask questions of the revolution on the governmental state structure. They're not asking it in that boring corporate law stuff that would increase the flow of the unstoppable flow of capital in a manner that actually may make sustainable the social, that helps you not be overdetermined by that unstoppable flow of the logic of capital, and actually can start helping fight against the return of the strong gods, right? But because you also mentioned the Web 3.0 stuff, I actually think this is evidence that this may work, is we're already actually seeing people beginning to accept new form, like not having certification. Here's the issue though. We need people to accept certification that is not based on quantification, but quality. Because if it's on quantification, even though it's a new form, it's not falling, it's still the same logical form of the certification. So you have to have people to determine quality of thought, quality of interaction, not just things that can be quantified, right? But they can do that. I mean, you can have someone come in and show you they have the quality of speaking, the quality of work to do that. But you also have to have the ability of people to give certification in terms of quality. So these are the two practical things that will begin. The political things are healthcare, housing, sustainability, breaking up the monopoly on credentials, and fixing tax structures to help the flow of capital. Those are all the practical things. Now, on the social, spiritual side of things, for people listening to this, people that hire or have businesses, take a risk and hire someone that passes a certification that isn't based on the current form of certification. Hire someone that when people say, why did you hire that guy? You'll feel embarrassed because you can't quantify it, but you've taken that risk and you're willing to do that. And if we started to have hundreds and thousands of people that would just hire one person or two people based on their own assessment of their quality that did not fall out, that fall in the realm of traditional forms of certification, which would require courage and bravery, that in of itself would be the introduction of a non-rationality to help us get out of equilibrium problems, and would actually be a revolutionary act. So everyone who can do that, do that. Give someone a shot who can't certify themselves. Give someone a shot who can't prove to you that they have what it takes. But when you speak to them, you sense it. You have an apprehension of that capacity. Take a risk and give that person a shot. And the last thing you should do is look through your life and ask yourself, am I doing something I can't justify to my neighbor that I believe is valuable? Is there any use of time that I have in my day that is towards something that I value but I can't explain or justify in terms of logic, status, or things like that? If you were to add one thing like that to your life, and you were to commit to it and actually do it, that would be a practical step toward forming a revolutionary form of subjectivity. And if you do it, your neighbor may actually then feel permission to do it, and then their neighbor may feel permission to do it. And we've started to move from a world where we're overdetermined by capital to one where we're only determined by capital. And that's when we can begin actually bringing about, I suppose, a revolutionary subjectivity.
Fantastic. There were certainly questions in there. There is no doubt about that.
I wasn't sure. They were in there.
Also responses. So, thank you, everybody. I'm going to do one final thing.
I just want to thank you, Tim. This was great. This this
was a lot of fun.
That was really great. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm very, very grateful for all three of you, and I look forward to more dialogues in the future. Now, as we close up, I want to ask each of you, and in the interest of time, you don't have to, I'm explicitly asking you not to justify this. There's no need for explanation. I'm curious if there was one person currently alive who may be contactable, who you would find to be valuable to bring into this conversation. If we were so fortunate enough to be sitting together, having this conversation around a dinner table, and we knew we got a couple more hours to hang out together, and someone could drop in and jump into the flow of the conversation we've had today, what thinker or person would you like to invite in? And I'll ask Benjamin first of all. And by the way, I will make the caveat for people listening. This isn't, I'm asking it on the fly. There's many people that could be named. There's no pressure to name the ultimate one. It's always very difficult because many people are worth honoring. So that's the caveat. Just someone who comes to mind.
Okay, I think of Weith Selk.
You had to choose a name that I don't know how to spell. So that's...
I will spell it for you. Veith space Selk. Weith is a German academic who has published extensively on retrogradism in politics, attempts to do things that are no longer possible, attempts to stick with things past the point of their relevancy. And he's also very interested in anything new political theory, new approaches to things. I have always enjoyed, ever since I first talking to him, and I've always wanted to get him to go on the internet. But, like many German academics, he is too modest often to go online. But if anybody could ever get him to go online, it would be a great time.
Beautiful. Daniel.
I mean, I'm sure Haven's standing outside that door right there. He could probably jump on in. So I'm not, on different things. People that come to mind. I would love to get Dr. James Hunter and people from the Advanced Cultural Institute more into this conversation. And Randall Collins. I think he's still alive. Hunter and Randall Collins. I'd love to speak with, I'd be very interested in their views on social change.
Brilliant. And Michel?
I would nominate my friend Mark Whitaker, who teaches in Seoul and has written an amazing book on the shifts from degenerative to regenerative jurisdiction alliances in history. So really great book. And also one on the bioregional state. He's an environmental sociologist. He has this kind of synthesis of 8 different theories. That is beyond me personally, but he's a very interesting person.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you to the Voicecraft Network members who were tuning in to this conversation. Tom and Kyle have had to take off. I believe Kai is still with us. We'll bring it to a close here. Thank you, everybody.